All right. So now that we've introduced the sort of four key concepts of historiography, mode of production, relations of production, and means of production, now we're going to look at a specific mode of production, and that is feudalism. Now, feudalism emerged in Europe after the collapse of the Roman Empire. Now, for those of you that are a little bit familiar with this, you don't have to know too much about the Roman Empire, but just know that in the classical period, what's referred to as sort of the classical period of European history, we're talking ancient Greece and ancient Rome. Now, Rome existed at first as a republic, sort of, from about 700 BC, really, to the first century BC, and then eventually became an empire under Caesar Augustus. And the empire existed in various forms, at least in Western Europe, till about the mid-400s or 5th century. It exists far longer in the eastern part of the Mediterranean, but you don't really have to know that. But the focus here is Western Europe. So by about the 5th century, it sort of collapses. And Europe emerges into what is often referred to as the Dark Ages. And part of the reason it's referred to as the Dark Ages is largely because, under sort of the unified political authority of Rome, you had this sort of great civilization that sort of reached its peak in the 1st century AD, but was sort of on a sort of slow decline after that. You had arts, you had culture, all sorts of things, philosophy that they adopted from the Greeks. And when this sort of collapses, when civilization or the Roman civilization collapses in Western Europe, political authority in Europe becomes increasingly fragmented. And it becomes fragmented in sort of two ways. One way it becomes fragmented is you get the emergence of sovereign states all over Europe. Okay, so you get the emergence of what eventually will become France, what eventually will become England, what eventually will become Spain and Portugal. Okay, so all of these countries at one point were part of the Roman Empire, but now they start to emerge as sovereign states. So political authority is fragmented. Instead of sort of one authority in Rome controlling all of Europe, or at least all of Europe that sort of surrounded the Mediterranean, North Africa, and parts of the Middle East, you've got these sort of new nations and sovereign states that are emerging. Again, France, Spain, Portugal, and England to a certain extent. But even within those states, political authority is somewhat fragmented. So these are sort of what become, in many ways, the first nations in the world, particularly England and France and Spain. But even at this period, under feudalism, it's not a very sort of centralized state. Authority, even though there is a king, isn't centralized and consolidated. It's fragmented. And I'll sort of show you what I mean by this. Okay, so if we go to our next slide. What I mean by political fragmentation, even within these states, is that you had a king, but the king didn't necessarily control all the land. The king was owed fealty by the nobility. Okay, now the nobility are the people that tended to control most of the land. The king himself probably owned a lot of land, but not all of it. And then under the nobility and lords, you had the serfs and the peasants. These were the people that actually worked the land. So the feudal system was very hierarchical, right? Monarch at the top. Underneath the monarch, you had the nobility and the lords. And then below them, you had the serfs and the peasants. And the role of the church I'll get to in a minute. So everything sort of funnels upward toward the monarch, okay? So the nobility, they control certain regions of the country, and it's not necessarily equal. Some noble lords control vast landed estates, others smaller. And basically what they do is they have to kick up a certain amount of, it's basically a sort of system of loyalty. Right, so the monarch at this time didn't necessarily have what we often would refer to as a national army. Often the monarch depended on their noble lords to supply soldiers, people that lived on their land when the monarch called upon them. They also had to pay taxes to the monarch, which is where they got most of their money. So what that means is even though the monarch sat at the top of this sort of pyramid, if you will, the monarch had indirect control over a lot of things. So they couldn't necessarily just push the nobility around. The nobility actually had quite a lot of power, and if they decided to, could probably overthrow the monarchy very easily. Because without the loyalty of the noble lords, the monarchy really doesn't have any power at that point. Now, below the nobility are the serfs and the peasants. And I'll explain a little bit what the difference is between a serf and a peasant. As feudalism started to emerge, especially in Western Europe, you had the emergence of what was referred to as serfdom. Now, a lot of what serfdom does is it replaces the kind of ancient slavery that existed into the Roman Empire. Now, the ancient slavery that existed is slavery, but it's not the same thing as slavery that emerges, say, in the Caribbean and the American South and Brazil. It's what we refer to now as plantation slavery that emerges in the 16th and 1700s. Now, I'll talk a lot more about what plantation slavery is, I think, 2 lectures from now when we look at the state in imperial expansion. But what a lot of ancient slavery was, if you were, a member of the nobility in ancient Rome, you had house servants. Now, most of those servants were not free laborers. They were slaves. The people that cooked your food, the people that served you, the people that basically ran your entire household were probably slaves, as opposed to free workers. So this system emerges out of that. So instead of slaves, you get what's referred to as serfs. Now, the difference between a serf and a slave is specific. So if a slave, you can buy and sell your slave, right? So if you were a Roman family and you had somebody that worked in your kitchen, you could literally sell that person to another family. Now, that's not how it works with serfs. Serfs aren't free, but they're not exactly slaves, even though many aspects of their life is similar to slavery. So the difference between a slave and a serf is that a serf cannot be bought and sold in the same way that a slave can. So if you're sort of a local lord, you have all these serfs working your land, you can't sell those serfs to the next town, right? But if you sell the land that the serf is on, the serf is sold with the land. Do you see what I'm saying? Right? They have no mobility. They can't really go anywhere. They are tied to that land. They can't be sold off the land, but if the land is sold, they get sold with it. That's the difference. And they can't leave the land legally. They're not allowed to. Or if they want to, they have to get permission from their lord. So this is sort of the difference between serfs. Now, what a peasant is a little bit different. Peasants have quite a bit more freedom. They're not free laborers. They might even own part of their land, but they are still required to work for the local landlord. And this is essentially how feudalism worked. So the lord lived in what was often referred to as a manor, and this is why it was called a kind of manorialism, and they controlled various tracts of land, thousands and thousands of acres in some case. Now, their job was to protect the serfs and the peasants that worked the land, protect them from marauders, protect them from another lord that wanted to come and steal their land, that kind of thing, thieves. And in exchange, the peasant and the serf basically kicked up their surplus agricultural products. So they worked the land producing various agricultural products, wheat, grain, this kind of thing, to feed the country, right? And they would work that land, and then the sort of the surplus of that would go to the lord. And we'll go a little bit to that in a minute. Right? You also have the church. Now, the reason the Catholic Church is so important is, remember I was talking about the political fragmentation of Europe. It's fragmented politically, but what ties everything together is, at least initially, Roman Catholicism. Okay, so all of these countries, even though they exist as sovereign states, still have a certain loyalty to the Bishop of Rome, which is the Pope. Even though the Roman Empire had collapsed, the Roman Catholic Church was still very much in Rome, later Vatican City. And so all these different countries exist as sovereign states, but they're still bound together by the Roman Catholic religion. Okay? So in a way, it's still the same civilization, but politically fragmented, right? The church doesn't control these countries politically, but has quite a lot of power within those countries. And the church also owns a lot of land. They also legitimize the entire system of feudalism. Right? And you have to remember, this is the sort of the divine right of kings, right? People believed at the time that the king was ordained by God to rule his or her specific kingdom, whether it be in France, Spain, or England. So the church, in many ways, provided a kind of spiritual legitimacy to this hierarchy within feudalism, right? And that's incredibly powerful, right? Stepping outside or challenging the social system meant you were challenging God's system in many ways. Now, the church also owned a lot of land itself and often functioned as a landlord that had serfs and peasants working its land, just like the local lords and nobility. Now, this was a extremely limited social and economic mobility, right? Like I said, if you're a serf, you basically are bought and sold with the land. Peasants also, even though they have a bit more freedom than serfs and sometimes can move around, they still very restricted social and economic mobility, right? If the Lord decides to, they can stop you from going certain places. And there was mutual obligations, again, as I got to earlier. The Lord essentially provided protection to the peasants and serf on his land, and the peasants and serfs worked the land and created the sort of agricultural surplus. Okay, so the next slide. So this just sort of sums it up here to a certain extent. The economic core is the transfer of agricultural surplus from serf to lord. The serf and the peasant is the individuals who actually work the land. And the economic unit that they function in is the family, right? So peasants would live as a family in sort of local villages. And what they would do is they'd have a tract of land that they had rights to, okay? And they would work that land. Now, how they lived was subsistence. So they may kick the transfer of sort of agricultural surplus to the lord, but they kept a little bit to live a sort of subsistence lifestyle. What subsistence means is that you farm just enough to feed your own family. They're not necessarily being paid, right? In exchange for sort of the right to farm that land, they have to kick up the agricultural surplus. Sometimes it's in direct transfers. Later, sometimes you get what's referred to as rent or taxes in the form of cash. But these societies, cash was sort of scarce at this point. So the relations of production in this specific system was mostly unfree, right? For the serfs, it was definitely unfree. For the peasants, there was a little bit more freedom than the serfs, but still, you know, they weren't exactly allowed to move around the country. It's paternalistic in that sense. It's not a purely economic relationship. The lord was considered your better, so to speak. Okay, so you didn't just give the fruits of your labor to your lord. You sort of existed under them. They weren't exactly the same thing as a king, but as far as a peasant was concerned, the lord may as well have been a king, right? You had to defer to them. There was a lot of sort of deference. You had to speak to them in a certain way. They were fundamentally considered to be better than you. It wasn't just that they were wealthier or more successful. The society was structured as such that they were your betters, and you owed them not just your allegiance, but also your agricultural surplus. And in exchange, their job was to protect you, or at least that's what you were supposed to do. And all this was undergirded by force. So one of the big difference between feudalism and what would eventually become capitalism is what is often referred to as extra economic means, right? It's not just an economic relationship between serf, peasant, and feudal lord. That's part of it. But it's also political. So the lord functioned not just as your boss, but also as your governor, right? So imagine if the person you worked for was the same as the person that ran the province or the city or the town that you lived in. So the point is, even though sort of political authority was fragmented, economic and political authority was fused together in the landlord. So the landlord was both your boss and essentially like the mayor or the premier or the governor, however you want to look at it. That's not the words they use. So what it meant was they had a monopoly on force. So if you refused to transfer your agricultural surplus to the lord would show up with men on horseback, knights sometimes a local army, and they would say, give it to us or we'll kill you or we'll run you off the land. So you had no choice in that respect. And that's a lot of how feudalism functioned. It didn't function on the laws of supply and demand, really. It didn't function in terms of competition. You weren't trying to become more efficient at production. What lords did was just squeeze the peasants and the serfs as much as they could, right? If they were short on money or if they were short on wealth or surplus crops, they would just squeeze the peasants even more, often by force. Right? They would send men on horseback, into the countryside and basically say to the peasants, here's what you have to give us. And if you don't, well, too bad. Okay. So this is essentially what feudalism was. Now, Even though feudalism focused mostly on the production of agricultural goods, there were what we often refer to as two prefigurative features of feudalism. Now, what the hell does prefigurative mean? What this means is two features of feudalism that existed that would become much more widespread under capitalism. So things like merchants and trade and handcraft production. Okay? Now, even though they existed under feudalism, they weren't sort of the central system. Everything under feudalism was mostly about agriculture and land and peasants' relationship with lords. You did have merchants, you did have trade, and you do have a little bit of what's referred to as handcraft production, which I'm going to talk to in the next video. But the point is, what we mean by prefigurative is that there are two features that will become unbelievably important under capitalism, but existed in the margins of feudal society, right? Most people that lived in a feudal society either lived as a peasant or lived in that aspect of it. A very small percentage of people in this society actually were merchants and engaged in, say, long-distance trade or engaged in handcraft production. It was a very small aspect of society. Of course, hundreds of years later, when we've kind of reached the transition from feudalism to capitalism, merchants and trade and handcraft production becomes a much larger feature of capitalism, and agriculture becomes smaller. Right? The amount of people working in agriculture becomes a lot smaller. So this is a lot of what we mean by the prefigurative features of capitalism. It's things that later, after there was the transition from feudalism to capitalism, would become much more important under capitalism, but still technically existed under feudalism. All right. Now, in the next video, we will look at merchant capital, long-distance trade, and a little bit at handcraft production.